Hello friends, AmyR here with Prairie Paper and Ink with a couple of cards using one of my oldie but goodie favorite stamp sets. This is the Simon Says Stamp Wildflowers stamp set. This came out, I don't know how many years ago. I've done about a dozen videos using this set, and I will have a playlist linked at the end of this video with all the different cards and videos I've done over the years using this set. And it's funny, someone mentioned in one of my recent videos in the comments, said something about waiting for me to pull this out again or something like that. And I was like, oh yeah, I haven't used this in a while. I should. Because it is one of my favorites. So, I was inspired by the sunrise when I was taking my kids to school the other day. The colors were just very pretty. I may live in the frozen north in Saskatchewan where it's just stupid cold. However, they don't call us the land of the living skies for no good reason. The skies are very pretty, and just the colors. And it was in my head, and then I was thinking about this stamp set, and I was like, oh yes, I know exactly what I'm going to do. So, I took an A2 piece of white cardstock. I'm using Hammermill cardstock for the blending and these card fronts. Any smooth white cardstock is going to work for this. I grabbed the Hammermill, so whatever works. This first panel, I have white heat embossed one of the images because this stamp set has two big silhouette florals. I'll call one the short one and one the tall one. And the short one is the one I white heat embossed on a panel. And then I pulled out several Distress Oxide inks, and this is where I'll give myself just a little pat on the back, because going with the colors that I saw, I did a combo that I never would have, just looking at all my inks, I would not do this on my own. I would not put these colors together. But I'm using Stormy Sky, Victorian Velvet, Kitsch Flamingo, Dried Marigold, and Speckled Egg. So I have all my oxides, and I've got my inkstand holders. I only have 4 of them, so the 5th one I'm just using one of my Positively, my little PET tools to hold the other one. And then I have my Ranger ink blending tools. With ink blends like this, I prefer using good old-fashioned ink blending tools because all my oxide ones are fully saturated with ink. And I get I want more lay down of ink. If I want a really nice blend, more smooth blend, I like my brushes, but I want to lay down a good amount of ink. So I have a second panel of white cardstock that is just the cardstock. There's no images because that'll be the second step. And then under my cardstock, I just have pieces of the Tim Holtz Tonic Media Grip that I have cut down to just slightly smaller than A2 size. And these just help kind of hold the cardstock a little bit so it's not sliding all over my glasswork surface. And then I just blend. And I've super sped this up in editing, but it's pretty basic, pretty simple, nothing too crazy. And as always, my camera makes my blend look worse than it actually is. But I'm also not super worried about that either, because of course I'm going to add splatter and all the things. If your blends aren't perfect, don't worry about it. 1, takes practice. 2, more often than not, if you're going to add some splatter, some images, sentiments, all the things, you don't even notice. So I had everything blended. And on the one that I had white heat embossed, I used my microfiber cloth to wipe off the ink that sat on top of the heat embossing because it's emboss resist. This second panel, I dried it with my heat tool because oxide inks do take a little longer to dry. So I made sure it was completely dry. And then I tested it. I used my anti-sag powder tool on it, and then I poured embossing powder over it and made sure that it wasn't, sticking to the entire background. And once I was sure it was dry, I am going to stamp the tall silhouette image set, or stamp. And I got this all lined up in my MISTI anti-sag powder tool again. This one I am going to stamp with the clear embossing ink, and I'm going to heat emboss it with clear embossing powder. This will effectively trap all of the colors I've ink blended underneath the heat embossing. So it's easier to show than to explain. So I stamped it, poured over the clear embossing powder, and then I'm going to melt that with my heat tool. So once I've got this completely melted, I need to be able to make this stand out, because once it's melted, you can see the shine, but you lose, all the detail of the image, everything. So poured over that clear embossing powder, melted this with my heat tool, and just like with the panel with the white, I tilt it back and forth in the light to make sure I have no dull, grainy areas. Everything's smooth, melted, good to go. So this is where I pull out Black Soot Distress Oxide ink, and you just cover it with this. And I know some people like freak out. It's part of the process, and it's fun. So everything's heat embossed. I'm adding the Black Soot Distress Oxide ink, and just completely covering this. All of the clear heat embossing is going to resist this ink, but because it's an oxide, it's still kind of sitting on top of the embossed images. The blending tool picks up a bit of it, but you can see it's kind of cloudy looking. Everything looks kind of mucky. I have a tissue in my hand. I'm going to use the tissue first to remove as much of the ink as possible that's sitting on the embossing, just because I don't want to get a ton of ink in my microfiber cloth. But I find that you need both in a sense, because while this seems to have removed a lot, the microfiber cloth actually removes even more of the ink that's sitting on top of the heat embossed image. So I wipe off as much as I can, and then, I've got it on my work surface, not worried about that. And then I take the microfiber cloth and just rub over that, and you can see immediately like how it just brightens up because it picks up that last little bit of ink that's sitting on top of the image. So emboss resist 2 ways. You could always leave it as is, but like I said, of course I'm going to add splatter. 1, because these are oxide inks, like distress oxide inks, they are water reactive. So my first bit is just splattering some water. So I'm going to use my spray bottle. I hold it up quite high and add just little splatters and water droplets to these backgrounds. And then I just pick that up with the tissue, and I've got that first effect, which is obviously way more apparent on the one with the black oxide, but it is visible on the other one as well. And then to add to the splatter effect, I'm going to add some Perfect Pearl splatter. So I've got Ranger Perfect Pearl powder in Perfect Pearl. I'm going to take a little bit of this out with my little fan brush. I'm just putting it on top of an acrylic block. I'm going to mix this with water, and I'm going to splatter it. Perfect Pearl powder, any of the specifically Perfect Pearl powders, because there's a bunch of different colors available. These have a binder in the powder that is activated with water. So you do not need any sort of sealant or anything like that, because people ask me that. With these, you don't. Other like mica powders or different powders might not have that, so I cannot comment as to whether or not that'll work. Like Pearl X, I think, is just pigment and there's no binders. From what I remember, I don't have any of my Pearl X powders anymore, so I can't compare. But from what I remember, I don't think those have a binder in them. So anyway, splatter this all over. I use every little bit. Flick it right off the acrylic block as well. So I splattered the heck out of those backgrounds with that Perfect Pearl powder and water. And then I took my Gonzai Tombi Starry Colors and just the gold watercolor, mix that up with some water, used my fan brush, and added gold splatter as well. Like just tons. I love the texture it creates, and it just makes this like, I don't know, the scenes it makes. And with this stamp set, this was fun. Anyway. On the insides of the cards, I've shown this many times, especially with this set, because it's one of my favorite things to do. I'm going to ink up these stamps with all of those same colors of oxide inks. What works best, especially because these are so large, is I hold these ink pads. You can't really tell because I'm filming straight down, but I'm holding the ink pads on an angle, and I'm using just the very edge of the ink pad so that I'm only inking up like small areas, not using the full ink pad. And then I do that kind of in a strip, and I started with the dried marigold. It's kind of the same theory I talk about when I'm doing like any sort of rainbow color. I use my lightest color first. The other ink pads will pick up tiny little bits of color on the very edge because, they're touching. It doesn't bother me. It doesn't wreck the ink pad. It's good to go. But I apply the ink, and then I use the same ink blending tool, and I use that to kind of soften the ink. And it also, it softens the blend between the colors. It also makes sure I get even coverage because, clear stamps sometimes like to resist ink a little bit, that sort of a thing. I am not worried about perfection. This is just going on the inside of the card, but this just helps smooth out the blend, and you see the results. So I do this with the inside of both my cards, which are top folding A2 white note cards. And I just do the exact same process, holding the ink pad on an angle, inking up a strip of the color, taking the blending tool and just like dabbing it all across the ink, and it just smooths everything out. It, you know, smooths out the blend in between the colors, and then it's good to go. And same thing, the blending tools will pick up a tiny bit of the other colors. I'm not worried about it. Like, totally fine. If you find that you've picked up a ton, you can just like wipe it off on a microfiber cloth, piece of paper towel, whatever. Same thing with your ink pads. If you find it's like the edge has picked up, you know, a very bright, vibrant color in your yellow ink pad or whatever, same thing. You can like dab that up with a little bit of paper towel. It'll be good to go. So did the same process with the other stamp. Stamp that onto the inside of the card. And again, these could be the outsides. I'm pretty sure in my playlist, one of my videos, I did actually a card front doing this same sort of technique. So yeah. Anyway, after I had done the card front panels, I die cut some gold glitter cardstock and some white cardstock with a couple of the sentiments from the CZ Design Basic Trio wafer die set. This is like a good go-to wafer die set. So I used the thanks and the hello words, and then I stacked 2 layers of the white die cuts together and then topped it with the gold glitter piece that I had die cut. So that gives it some dimension, and it's got some sparkle, all fabulous. So after I had stacked all of those sentiments together on the insides of the cards, the ink is dried, everything's good to go, and I'm going to stamp a sentiment from another favorite of mine. This is the XL Greetings. I have to pull it out here. 2, because there's multiples. Simon's released a bunch, and some of my favorite sentiment sets, and this is one of my absolute favorite sentiments. You guys have seen me use this in a ton of videos. So pulled that sentiment out from that set. I'm stamping that with VersaFine Clair Nocturne ink on the inside of both of these cards. So I lined it up in my MISTI, inked up the stamp, stamped it, brought in the other inside of the card, and stamped that again with that same ink. Once I've got those stamped, let that ink dry as well, because the Nocturne ink does take as well a little bit of time to dry. And then folded my cards shut, adhered these card fronts to the card base with craft tacky glue, because that gives me that little bit of wiggle room that I always need to get things lined up. Once that's adhered, I'm going to put these just under my MISTI just to hold everything down, hold it flat while the adhesive dries. Once those are adhered, I can then adhere my die cut sentiments, and I pulled out my trusty little T-square ruler for this because, again, I need all the help I can get getting things lined up nowadays. And I decided where I wanted to place the sentiment. So with the short silhouette stamp, I put the sentiment higher up on the card. And then with the tall silhouette stamp, I put the sentiment lower down on the card. Just personal preference. So I adhered those into place, and yeah, get my head in the way as well, because wanted to make sure this was straight, because things were looking wonky. I wasn't sure. Hence the T-square ruler, because it just, yeah. Anyway, got that adhered. And then, of course, this is like, it's like my previous video. I think it was a recent video when I was saying, like, these go together like peanut butter and jelly. This silhouette stamp set and Simon's Flickering Butterflies wafer die set go together like peanut butter and jelly. They're just meant to be. I pulled out some gold vellum from my stash. I haven't shown this in a long time because this stuff, when I used it years ago, like, it was super popular. Have not been able to get it since. So I didn't want to keep like poking the bear. However, Tonic has released some metallic vellums, including a gold vellum. I do have it on order. It hasn't shown up yet, but I'm pretty sure it's very similar to this. I will have a link, like I do with everything else, all the supplies. I will link to that vellum. So yeah, I die cut gold vellum with these flickering butterflies, and then just adhered them with little tiny dabs of craft tacky glue. Like I always say with vellum, you can see adhesive through it, especially liquid adhesive, but like I always say with these little butterflies, that tiny little dab of glue in the center, it's fine. It's so not noticeable. It just, I don't worry about it at all. I don't feel the need to cover it up or add anything. I just adhere them, and I let the wings kind of pop up because it gives it a bit of dimension. All the leftover butterflies go right back in the package. So I've got them to use on my next project, and they're good to go. And then I paired these cards with some metallic cornflower envelopes from Simon. The color was just perfect. It really was. So everything was just chef's kiss. Love when that happens. So, like I mentioned, I will have links below the video to my blog post. I'll have a supply list. I'll link to all the supplies I used. You can check that out below if you are interested. Thank you all so very much for taking the time to watch my videos, for thumbs upping and commenting. That literally very much helps. It tells the robot overlords that manage these algorithms and all the craziness that you guys like what you see, and it'll keep pumping it out. So you guys hopefully will see more of my videos featured and other people will see them, etc. So it does really very much help, and I appreciate it. And subscribe if you haven't. I'd love that as well. And I will see you all very soon in the next video. Bye.